Hello again and welcome back to our course on PSE 15. In this section we're going to look at using the erasers. Now you may well think that using erasers must be pretty straightforward, but in PSE 15 there are some very important factors to take into account. There are a number of different erasers, and what happens when you use the erasers depends on a number of factors, such as, for example, whether you're dealing with vector graphics or raster graphics, and on the layers in the image that you're working on. I'm going to explain those things during this section. Let's start with some very straightforward eraser behavior. The erasers are in the draw group, top right hand corner, and we have the eraser, we have the background eraser, and we have the magic eraser. Let's start with a straightforward use of the eraser. We choose a brush size in the usual way. We choose the opacity. And then we can either use a pencil eraser, which is very useful for very accurate erasing, particularly, say, around a detailed edge. The brush eraser, which works pretty much as brushes usually would do. And then you have the block eraser. I'm going to start with a brush eraser, and I'm going to erase part of the sheep. Now if you look at this sheep, you'll see that it's in a layer called layer 1 on top of the background copy layer of the horses in the field. So the first thing I need to do is to select the layer with the sheep on it. Then I'm going to choose my brush size. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than it is there. Now watch what happens as I start to erase the sheep. As I erase it, I see what's in the next layer, which of course is the background copy layer, and I see the horses in the field. So erasing in this case is as straightforward as that. I'm erasing the content of a layer and I'm seeing what's in the layer behind. Before we move on, let me just talk about those other types of eraser for a moment. I mentioned the pencil eraser, which is very good for doing very detailed work. In fact, the block eraser is pretty good for that as well. You can't vary the size of the block. I believe the current size is 16 pixels by 16 pixels. But if you want to do detailed erasing, particularly of rectangular areas on an image, using the block, clicking with blocks or even swiping with blocks, can give you very accurate results. But primarily in this section I am going to continue to use the brush. Back to our basic erasing examples then. What I'm going to do now is to make that layer invisible, and I'm going to draw a new layer, a custom shape onto this image. Let's go for that heart. Suppose I want to erase part of that heart. Let me select the eraser tool again. Let me start to erase over the heart. Well, straight away I run into a problem, and based on what I told you about in the previous section, you probably realize what the problem is. This custom shape is done in vector graphics, and we cannot use digital tools such as the eraser on it. You can't delete the individual pixels on a layer with vector graphics. So what we need to do is to simplify the shape to make it into a digital, a raster image. I'm going to say OK to this. That layer is now simplified, and now a raster graphics layer. Now let me try to erase, and it works in the same way that the layer with the sheep on works. So that's another factor to be aware of when you are using custom shapes in an image. Next, let me make shape 1 and layer 1, both of those layers invisible. All I can see now is the background copy layer, but I'm going to make the background layer visible as well. What would happen now if I erased part of the picture of the horses in the field? Well, let me select the background copy layer and brush over it. And what appears to happen as I erase is that nothing is happening at all. But in fact, it is erasing. And the reason that nothing appears to be happening is that my background layer is showing through. If you look up at the top right hand corner and you look at the background copy layer, you'll see that part of it has been erased. If I switch off the background layer, of course, you can see what's been erased. So parts of the background copy layer that I erase are actually transparent, and I'll only see something there if the background layer is visible. Let me swap these two now. Let me make the background copy layer invisible and the background layer visible. And of course all of the background layer, the original background layer, is still there. I haven't erased anything from that layer yet. What would happen if I tried to erase from the background layer? Let me select that layer, use the same eraser and erase. What do you think would happen? Well, what I would get is the background of this layer, and the background of this layer is white. There's nothing behind it. I don't see through it. Its background is not transparency. Its background is white. So I've erased part of that image, but all I can see is the white background of this layer. However, given the current state of that background layer, if I now choose the background eraser tool, I can erase the background of this layer. What would happen if I erase the background of this layer? What I would get is transparency. So on this one layer of the image, the one that's the original background, the foreground is the picture with the horses in it. The background is white. And if I delete the foreground and the background, I have transparency. Having shown you the basic use of the erasers in PSE 15, I'd now like to look at a couple of, if you like, special cases or special uses. And one of them is a use of the background eraser to erase the background from an image. This best works where what you want to erase, the background that you want to remove from the image, is clearly distinct from the object or objects that you want to leave. I'm going to return to our sheep standing on a field here. That layer is selected, and I've also selected the background eraser tool. I'm going to set the tolerance quite low at the moment. As usual, as I'm sure you expect by now, things like tolerance settings you need to experiment with. I'm going to set the brush size at, say, 57 pixels. That will do. Now the way this works is that I erase background, so let me just erase some background over here, that's fine. But at any time, what the background eraser does is it samples the pixel under the crosshair in the middle of the cursor there, and if it finds colours within the circle that are significantly different from the colour it's just sampled, it won't delete them. Now watch what happens as I try to delete the grass just near the sheep. That's fine there, but when I get the cursor a little bit closer so that the crosshair cursor is over the grass but the circle starts to go over the sheep, it realizes that it's dealing with a different color and it doesn't erase the wool on the sheep. Now let me do this with a slightly bigger brush. So the important thing is not to let the crosshair go onto the sheep, or the sampling of the sheep will mean that the background eraser will erase part of the sheep as well. All the time that I'm careful enough and keep the cursor away from the sheep, then as long as the circle goes over the edge of the sheep's wool, the background will get erased. Everything within the circle gets erased except the pixels that are outside a tolerance closeness to the color under the cursor. So that's where the tolerance comes into it. How much of a difference do you need to have to be considered to be a different color? Now in that way, obviously for areas well away from the sheep, I don't have the same issues, but in that way I can remove the background using the background eraser tool and hopefully leave a reasonably well selected sheep. Finally, let's take a look at the magic wand. This is a tool that works very well, but only in quite specific circumstances in my experience. It works best when you want to delete part of an image which is a very, very different colour from the part of the image that you want to keep. I think it will work reasonably well on this picture of an iris. And the principle of the magic wand is a little bit like the background eraser, but you don't have to brush. It works solely on the basis of colour. So I set my tolerance as usual, and again you'll need to experiment with this depending on the image. I'm going to keep it at the default 32 just for the moment. And then what you do, having selected the magic wand, is you click on a colour that you don't want to keep, any pixel of that colour. Now I'm going to keep the flowers but remove all of the foliage. So let me click on a bit of green. Notice that I've got contiguous unchecked, so I'm getting every patch of green within a tolerance of 32 of the colour of the pixel that I clicked on. Let me increase that tolerance. Let me put it right up to say 72. Click on some more green, some of the darker green, and as you can see, with that fairly high tolerance, I've really got rid of just about everything that isn't the colour of the iris. In fact, I've managed to get rid of a little bit of the iris as well, so I'd need to adjust this a little. But the key point here is that there is quite a distinct colour difference between the colour of the iris that I'm keeping and the colour of the foliage that I am erasing. If you were to try, say, using the magic eraser on the picture of the sheep, if you click somewhere in the grass outside, that's fine. But you've actually got quite a lot of the sheep there. Let me undo that. Let me reduce the tolerance back round to, say, 32 again. Let me click now. I haven't got any of the sheep, but as soon as I start clicking in other parts of the image, eventually I'll start to lose parts of the sheep, such as there. So to some extent this one comes down to a balance between how suitable the image is and how much time you're prepared to spend on erasing the parts of the image that you don't want. That's it for this section. Please join me in the next one.